Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, thanks very much for joining us today. Hopefully you've listened to our other podcasts on defining your carbon footprint, quantifying your carbon footprint, and today's episode is going to be all about the commitment stage, which is where you need to actually take some action and do something about it. But the following episodes, for those of you that have just joined this episode for the very first time, just to let you know that this is actually part 3 in a 7-part series on Carbonology, which is all about helping you to be able to define, quantify, commit, reduce, requantify, offset, and declare carbon neutrality, which in theory should be part of your sustainability journey. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome back David.
Hi Mel, thanks for having me on again.
Great. You're becoming a pro at this.
Yeah.
So it's great to have you back, David. So up until this stage then, we've covered off a lot of the technical aspects in terms of scope and boundaries and the number crunching in terms of the quantification. So there's been an awful lot of talk about theory and calculations, but I'm quite excited to have a chat with you about this stage, the commit stage, because this is where we can actually make some changes. So this is so exciting because I think a lot of organisations at this current time are just chomping at the bit to try and do something to make a positive change to their organisation and to other key stakeholders involved. So really keen to drill down into, some examples of, what's involved with the next stage, this level of commitment, and how organisations go about setting goals, timelines and actions as well. So over to you, David, with looking at the commitment stage. Where would you like to begin?
Yeah, so like you said, it's mostly been theory up to this point and number crunching on spreadsheets. So this is where you really set, goals, timelines and do, actual actions. So like you said, and this needs making carbon footprint management plan or carbon reduction plan, depending on your terminology, an overall sustainability strategy to reduce your emissions. And if you're an organisation that's fortunate enough to have emission removals in your boundaries, enhancing those so you can take even more emissions out of the atmosphere. So if you're an organisation that operates an environmental management system or energy management system, it's a really good opportunity to align your new sustainability objectives with those of your existing management system, and vice versa, because the results of your emission quantification can be really useful to help inform decisions within your current management system.
Yeah, so many of our listeners will have an environmental or an energy management system, but they haven't gone down the route of making a formal commitment in terms of carbon reductions, because it's not actually specifically a requirement within either of those standards. It's not specified as such. So this is going to be a real enhancement, isn't it, to any business's environmental or energy management systems. Or even if a company doesn't have those systems established, it's just, I think it's expected now to make that commitment in terms of what an organisation is planning on doing about being more environmentally friendly and making that pledge to be carbon neutral.
Exactly, and it's a good way to demonstrate continual improvement, really.
Yeah. Okay, great. So obviously you need a bit of a plan when it comes to reductions. So could you kind of just walk us through what's involved with that then?
Yes, so if you're looking to achieve past 2060, you need to make reductions in emissions over time. That's what the standard wants you to do. And as you said, if you're going to do this, you need a plan, a carbon footprint management plan or carbon reduction plan. I mean, to start off, this could involve looking at, say, renewable energy, with a much more sustainable supply with less emissions embedded in it. A very common thing organisations are looking at the moment is transitioning to an electric car fleet or electric commercial vehicle fleet in the near future, or even switching out, your old electrical equipment, laptops, heaters, phones for much more efficient models, or, ideally simply just using fewer resources. So, the purpose of this step in producing a carbon footprint management plan is to look at your overall carbon footprint that you've quantified and see how, realistically it can be reduced, and then set targets over specific time spans. As I mentioned a moment ago, if you're an organisation that's fortunate to have identified emission removals, again, actively removing emissions from the environment within your boundaries, as well as making reductions, you need to enhance those removals to make sure you're taking even more out of the atmosphere and helping the Earth.
So there are lots of different ways that an organisation can reduce their carbon emissions. So over the last year, since you've been, working with clients on this, what are the most popular ways to, I know this is a very broad question, but what would you say the most popular things that organisations are doing right now to reduce their carbon emissions?
So at least with the companies I've worked with, it's energy and travel, really. So again, simple solution to reducing travel is don't travel. So, work from home, use virtual meetings, although everyone might be a bit fed up of it now. It's, technically a bit better for the environment, at least for the organisations I've looked at and modelled it for. And then in terms of energy, it's about making it doesn't happen overnight. It's about making small improvements over time. So again, not that you should be buying a new laptop every year necessarily, but where you can, getting a much more efficient model of everything. And, I find some companies, they have quite a large bill overnight for their office, which they necessarily shouldn't have. Turning stuff off at the end of the day because you don't want to be eating and lighting your office overnight when no one's there. Yeah, it's energy and travel for the companies I work with, really.
Okay. Is that, do you think, because you're predominantly working with professional services type organisations?
For me personally, yes. If you're in a sort of manufacturing company, again, using fewer resources or more sustainably sourced resources, could go in your favour.
So you mentioned about, establishing targets. Could you just provide some examples of the approach that you need to take when you're setting targets?
Yeah, so I find communication is important at this stage with the organisation. The targets do need to be ambitious, but they should also be realistic. They should also be time orientated. So over a set amount of years, you should be reducing, X by X percent. You should also have measures in place to monitor and determine your reductions. Going back a few stages, ideally in the quantify stage, you would have learned a bit more about your organisation, how best to collect and record data, and potentially design yourself a nice spreadsheet to continually collect data and monitor emissions. This allows you to, track performance on quite a granular level, potentially over a monthly basis. Also means you can take preventative measures should any issues arise, a spike in electricity or water use somewhere. You'll have immediate visibility of that if you're doing it on a monthly basis rather than just looking at it at the end of the year. Another thing with reductions, there's a bit of an elephant in the room for most organisations, is that if you're looking to expand and make more money and grow, which I imagine every organisation in the world is looking to do, we're looking to make more money. Generally, if you grow, your emissions are going to increase. The way you can, let's say, get around this, but the way you can demonstrate improvements and demonstrate reductions is looking at it from an intensity point of view. So emissions intensity, so normalizing that to say headcount, say your tons of CO2 per person or your tons of CO2 per pound spent or pound of revenue, or for example, tons of CO2 per meter squared of your premises, because this allows you to demonstrate that even though your absolute emissions are increasing, you are making efficiency improvements and becoming a more sustainable organisation overall.
Yeah, that makes total sense, because you can't really be penalised for growing as an organisation. Otherwise, businesses aren't going to take this seriously, are they? So I think being able to optimise resource efficiency across all aspects of the organisation, whether you're working from home or working in an office or in a manufacturing site, it's about looking at ways to reduce your overall CO2 emissions regardless of the size of the company and what your expansion plans are. So in terms of the targets then, you mentioned about that they need to be realistic. And ideally, you need to set them over a period of time to allow for any variables. Could you provide, some examples of the typical sorts of targets that an organisation may want to put in place? And I know this is a very, very general question, but it's just to help our listeners to think, well, actually, yeah, we could reduce our X by X over X period of time, but they might be wondering where to even begin with it. So could you provide a few examples?
I mean, one common example that I often use is going back to business travel is looking at, modelling if all your fleet switched to an electric vehicle tomorrow, what would your emissions be? And then that's a good target to aim for. The roadblock there is not every company can or wants to switch immediately to electric vehicles, whether that's, personal vehicles or commercial. But, by doing the exercise and looking at the difference between a petrol fleet and an electric fleet, you can see the difference and then set a target around that over a certain number of years, which is generally a long-term thing, particularly for commercial vehicles. You're looking at least 10 years before they're, a viable option, but that's one way you can do it. Another simple one, like I mentioned a moment ago, is, looking at what if you switch to entirely renewable energy, or next step above that, installing your own renewable energy on your premises, solar panels or wind turbines.
So you can increase the percentages over a period of time. So, again, being realistic, if you had a 5-year plan to convert, your vehicles from, say, diesel to electric, it could be, okay, so our target in 2022 is 10%, and then by 2023 we want it, to be 25%, or, so you could do that over a period of time and then do the calculations, could you, based on not just the cost savings, but also the GHG emissions as well?
Exactly, yeah. It's good to look at, again, going back to electric vehicles, it's good to model it on a technology that exists and not rely on something speculative that's going to, magically appear in 10 years, which may not necessarily work out as a technology.
Yeah. And do most businesses have like a launch and a communications plan? Because obviously it's one thing setting targets, but if you want to initiate change, you need everybody involved in it, don't you?
Exactly. Ultimately you need everyone in your organisation to contribute to these targets in one way or another. Hence, a communications plan is very important for specific emission sources and area of the business. It's very important to have that communications plan in the carbon footprint management plan as part of it. And I believe this is something we're going to go into a bit more detail on in the next podcast.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it until then. Okay, cool. So thanks very much for explaining that, David. So what are the typical outcomes and deliverables then at this stage that you would be expecting to provide an organisation with?
So yeah, to summarise, you're going to get a carbon footprint management plan out of this. You'll have a set of targets over a set number of years, and then the actions of how you plan to achieve them. Again, keeping it realistic, basing it on what's technically feasible for your organisation, what's within budget, and again, relying on technology that actually exists at this moment. And then, as I mentioned, in previous podcast, a great incentive to actually achieve reductions is that it can save your organisation money, both through, increasing the efficiency of your own actions and by reducing the cost of the number of offsets you're going to need to purchase each year if you're looking to achieve carbon neutrality. So that cost will go down if your emissions go down. And in terms of, like I mentioned a minute ago, renewable energies, this will require an initial investment, renewables being one example. But this can lead to a return on that investment over time if you start saving money.
Okay, and so in certain countries it's actually a requirement, isn't it, to have a carbon reduction plan or carbon footprint management plan in order to be able to bid for tenders. So do you think that's going to be more commonplace, for all different sizes of organisations? I know it's aimed at organisations that are bidding for contracts like over £5 million in the UK with the government, but do you think that that's going to cascade down into medium and smaller organisations as well?
Yes, personally, I think having a carbon footprint management plan or carbon reduction plan as part of a tender is going to be more common. And not only that, I think the actual requirements of it are going to start getting a bit more complex. And I think the expectation on businesses is going to be a bit higher, not just to, report on the easy stuff, your electricity and your gas and your company vehicles. I think the expectation in the next few years is going to be a lot higher that companies should be reporting on their wider Scope 3 emissions. But only time will tell.
So obviously this could be an internal document for the board, this carbon footprint management plan. It could be used in terms of the sales and marketing department. But then from an operational perspective, what would you recommend that an organisation does with that?
Definitely inform your staff about it. Don't just write it and publish it on the website and, publish it on your, staff Facebook, whatever. Definitely, inform staff this is what they need to do or should be doing to reduce their emissions, and then not only just tell them what to do. I suggest providing incentives to actually encourage them to do something. Again, sorry, I keep mentioning electric vehicles, but if possible, support your staff financially to actually switch to electric vehicles if that's something you're aiming for, or support them to be able to walk to work or cycle to work or work from home to reduce emissions. It's not just about telling them what to do. It's about supporting them and communicating the benefits to them.
So this is where it's starting to become, taking it from the definition stage through to the quantification. Now we're moving into the commitment. It is really a true commitment from all key parties, including employees. So, yeah, which actually I think that's where we kind of come on to the next podcast, isn't it? When we're looking at how we can actually make that happen.
Exactly, yes. And you mentioned about keeping it internal. At some point, you're also going to have to start liaising with your suppliers and your contractors and subcontractors, and making sure they can contribute in their own way to your carbon reduction plan.
Oh, well, I look forward to hearing more about that and hints and tips on that in the next episode, David. But thanks very much for sharing with us about the commit phase in Carbonology. That's been really insightful. Thank you.
It's okay. Thank you for having me on again.
Great. Well, just a reminder that if any of our ISO Show listeners would like to have a free one-to-one session with David, feel free just to drop him a line. His contact details will be in the show notes on our website, which is isologyhub.com or blackmoresuk.com, or on your media player. So we'll be more than happy to arrange a free one-to-one to discuss putting together a carbon footprint management plan in place for you. So on the next episode, we'll be looking at reductions, which is really interesting because this is where we can start to actually make a difference, which is what it's all about. This is where we're going from, the top level policy and documentation in terms of having that carbon footprint management plan into actually making some real reductions so we can see the return on the results as well. Okay, so I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show. Thanks very much for listening.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.